All right, everyone, we're going to get started on our next session. I do want to remind everyone as well that all the sessions on both the Stream 1 and Stream 2 are being recorded. They will be available by the end of the week, hopefully over the weekend, so you'll be able to catch anything that you've missed as well. I have the absolute pleasure of introducing Caroline Bowler. She is the CEO of BTC Markets. Caroline actually is one of the first women I met in the blockchain space. She is a wonderful advocate for me, and I'm very happy to have her as a friend as well as work alongside her. So I welcome her to the stage if she wants to come up now. I'd also like to introduce Yat Siu. He is the Managing Director and Chairman of Animoca Brands. We're going to be having a little fireside chat with the two of them, so welcome.
Thanks, everybody, and hi, Yat. I know you're here virtually, so much appreciated for sharing your time with us. And hello to everybody watching online. Top tip, don't go from decaf to caffeinated beverages just before you interview Yat Siu and have such a headline. The hands are shaking, mostly from nerves and from caffeine. So we'll get cracking into it, and apologies if I make any boo-boos on the way. So firstly, Yat, I know that you have been a big advocate for an open metaverse. So before we go any further, do you want to just share your views and kind of your manifesto in that regard?
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure and honor to be here. So yeah, Animoca Brand's vision really is to build basically the open metaverse. And from our perspective, it starts with digital property rights, meaning that for the first time, we're now in a position where we can actually really own our digital assets. And that means also that we have the ability to compose freely on top of it because it's permissionless. And this is how we actually interact in the real world, right? If you think of it in a different way, much of what we do virtually is in some way a supercharged version of how we exist physically, right? The way we make friends, for instance, traditionally has been through the people we can physically interact with. Online has allowed us to interact with people, not just in the limitations of what we do physically, but actually virtually. So it supercharged our ability to make, instead of 10 or 20 friends, we could make 100 friends, 200 friends. We could make 10,000 connections online that we couldn't normally do. And what we're really seeing is the compounding of network effects that we as humans and as individuals are now able to do. And this happens with all the objects and assets that we have in the physical world as well. The digital space basically amplifies this. And the open metaverse is essentially the way in which we can amplify and have an ownership of this. Because right now, all that amplification that we have of our own social networks, of our own friendship circles, of our own business circles that we have online, the power of all of that, actually, we don't own any of that in the Web 2 paradigm. So in the Web 3 paradigm, we do. And it can only function this way if it is open, because only if it's open can we actually own it and compose a new and added network effects on top of it.
If I can be so bold as to perhaps ask a slightly critical question. Animoca Brands are well known for their very generous and large coffers, and they currently own about 150 companies that are linked to the metaverse. I know you've spoken about there being an open metaverse environment, but how would you answer critics who say that Animoca are kind of similar to Meta in that they are owning and aggregating so many of these companies in one go?
Well, there's one big difference. Companies like Meta actually own the companies. In our case, we don't actually own them. We invest in them. And it goes back to our original ethos, where we basically believe very strongly that the best people in the world are not going to work for you. They're going to work with you. And so we treat our portfolios and the companies we work with actually as peers. Now, if we acquired every single company we worked with, for instance, if we owned 100% of it, then I would say the criticism is true. But it's not. It's not how we operate. We don't acquire them. We invest in them, which means we also don't just invest ourselves, but we bring other parties, we bring other people into the community, into the companies that we're supporting, into the DAOs we're supporting, because we also feel very strongly that those companies will grow better if they have a lot of the other smart folks in there to help them out, right? So I think because we don't, as a company, need to control every single thing, as a traditional company used to, where they would consolidate everything, we're happy to have a sizable stake or a reasonable stake in the business. And as it grows, we may, lessen our position because they end up becoming, more independent, and that's okay from our perspective. And I think the other way to think of this is that, in the future, especially with DAOs, we think the construction of these can only really last the ages if the majority, and in this case, we mean what traditionally we used to call customers, but it's really the end users of the platform or the product or the service that is, being used, if they actually have a true say in it. Imagine what Facebook would be like today if actually the users of Facebook actually had a say in how it's run. It would be very different, and it perhaps would be a better place for all of us, but it's not like that today. And so that's why this whole notion of decentralization is so important. Decentralization means that ownership is actually shared across a very large group of people who form a sort of crowd consensus to guide the organization, whatever it may be, into the right direction. In fact, you could say it's perhaps, democracy in its perhaps most truest form.
And just with that, actually, if we can talk a little bit about DAOs in particular, and moving on to ApeCoin, if we can, obviously, which is a
Sure.
huge success. And I know for ourselves at B2C Markets, we're going to hopefully list ApeCoin very soon. It's already gone past our risk and compliance team, so that's very good. So with that, can you talk us through the setup of the Ape Foundation, the DAO that's based around the ApeCoin, which I know obviously you're a member for at least the next 6 months?
Correct. Yeah. So the way the foundation is set up is that we basically guide. You can think of us as stewards for the next 6 months. A number of people, which include Alex Ohanian, Amy Wu from FTX, Maria from Sound Ventures, myself and Dean from Horizon. We basically are the sort of, let's call it starting council, as it were, to advise sort of the direction in which it is, and we have to be elected. And so every ApeCoin holder at the end of the cycle gets to vote on whether we get to continue and whether we do a good job or not. So it's kind of like a delegation, if you will, no different than an election. And I guess in that sense, we have some sort of discretion in terms of what we can do. But for major decisions, we have to put out proposals, that we have to ensure that these proposals are then being, to some extent, implemented, right? So for instance, we propose, for instance, a staking proposal. The community has to vote. The community owns most of the tokens that are in circulation, so they would basically end up voting in the future in terms of, what to do with it, right? And that's basically, how it's constructed. And frankly, I think it's a model for, all DAOs essentially in the future as well. And 6 months is sort of the cycle we're going through at the moment. I think, really the goal for us is to further, the mission and the purpose and the inclusion of ApeCoin to as many people as possible.
Just with that, if I could again could be a little bit critical, because I think we all saw the comments from Vitalik with regards to some of the NFT projects, and he's made some comments around Bored Ape in particular being used for people who like Lamborghinis and so forth. It was slightly dismissive. For the record, I drive a Mazda, just so we're clear. So some of the criticisms around Bored Ape project in particular, and then ApeCoin, is that Bored Ape is seen as the project, the NFT for the wealthy. And there's about 6,300 people who own a Bored Ape. Of that, about 500 own three or more. And so when the ApeCoin airdrop happened, there was an argument put forward that this was just a transfer of wealth to even more wealthy people. I think there was $1.something billion worth of value that was transferred across. And in the opening days of trading, the value of that coin went up by about 24%. So are those who there are those who are critical and say that, as I say, it's a bit of a vanity project for the wealthy. How do you respond to those criticisms? What's your view on that?
So first, maybe I think the value perspective, I think let's address that, and then we can talk about sort of the question around wealth and what that may all mean. First, when we talk about NFTs, generally speaking, and we talk about value, our perspective is that actually everything that we do in life today, physically, that we purchase physically, in fact, as well, is actually a form of a social identifier. Right. So meaning that whatever clothes we buy, whatever cars we buy, whatever shoes we buy, actually are forms of social identification. And they may not necessarily all be for status or to show that you have money, but they say something about you. And so when you give an example, I often give this example between a Birkin bag and a Bored Ape. And, actually Bored Apes now are more valuable than Birkin bags. But when I give this example, they were roughly the same price at the time in terms of floor Birkins versus floor Apes. And I asked the question, when you buy a Birkin bag, what in fact are you buying? Are you buying the materials? Are you buying the fact that you can hold it, or that you can actually sort of put goods inside your bag and take it from place to place? Because if so, a regular plastic bag will do just fine. In fact, what you're buying is the network effect of the bag in terms of what it represents. Birkin bags are the stories, what people think of it, who else uses it. It's a compound network effect of the story around, the Birkin bag, which might be manufactured by a marketing company or might be community driven. And this is also the reason why we determine maybe I buy a Nike shoe versus an Adidas shoe versus a Puma shoe. None of those shoes make us run faster, but we have some kind of affinity. When we buy a car, which by the way is a terrible investment for the most part, right, in terms of a return, if you think of it that way, but we buy it because we want to say something. Like you own a Mazda is maybe saying something else from someone who owns a Rolls Royce, right, or who's buying a Tesla, or who's buying a Jaguar, or who's buying, basically a Toyota, right? There are different things that we're saying about ourselves. So all NFT projects, big and small, have similar social identity and social identifier values attached to it. And they come with a network effect that is embedded within it. In other words, how popular is it? What are the stories? And what is the utility? Where else can it be used? Just as we have in the physical world. So why is Bored Apes, for instance, so valuable? Remember, Bored Apes didn't start off valuable. The mint was, minuscule in value, maybe hundreds of dollars back in the day, if that. In fact, the same is true for CryptoPunks. Those were entirely free for those who forget, right? This isn't the case where, Yuga Labs sold Bored Apes for $100,000 each, right? This is not the case at all. What happened was they gave them away literally for almost nothing. And then the community within the group gave it value because they added their own network effect on top of it. One other thing, every time you buy a Bored Ape, the owner, the intellectual property, everything belongs to the owner of that Bored Ape, which means that I can take this Bored Ape and I can print t-shirts if I want to do. I can commercialize it entirely, which is what Yuga Labs did once they acquired CryptoPunks. They said, you now own those commercial rights around that, and you can transfer those rights to someone else as long as they actually own that particular NFT. So that means embedded. It allows for larger and deeper construction of network effects. And so the value that some might say, oh, but it's just a JPEG. It's kind of frivolous in its effect. It's just vanity. So yes, from a perspective of a picture, it might appear this way. But when you look deeper, actually, you own the commercial IP rights to it. If your Bored Ape is famous, you could sell it. If the Bored Ape was owned by Jimmy Fallon and you now own it, you can now say, this is Jimmy Fallon's, former Bored Ape, and I can sell that, which is how autographs work, which is how art work, which is how all forms of value that we see in the physical work as well, except now you can own a stake in it, which is something that you couldn't really do before. So I would say that the value that you see in these expensive NFT projects didn't start valuable. They became valuable because they had network effects embedded within it. So then we go into the question of, but didn't we just, the question about sort of wealth and wealth sort of distribution and so on. Well, it's kind of like, what happens if all of us who, happen to own Bentleys, as an example, being rather sort of extreme here, were sort of given a sort of monetization event out of that? What would that look like from a community value? I would say that the value that the ape ecosystem represented is already the value of the community that currently sort of holds these apes, right? In other words, their value was a translation of what was already there embedded. The network effects within the NFTs translated into essentially the token that was issued to that community. Now, the point on this, though, is that it actually creates a kind of redistribution of that as well, because maybe I can't own a Bored Ape anymore because it's expensive. However, I could own Ape, and Ape basically is a way in which you can participate and grow the community through and still benefit from that community as it enhances and grows, but not having to specifically own an Ape. And so if you look at our staking proposals that we gave to the community, AIP 4 and 5, you will note that actually the single largest staking percentage that we give actually is the ones who actually own Ape alone without having to pair it with a Bored Ape or a mutant ape or a kennel dog. And that was intentional because it was basically trying to signal that, yeah, if you own the NFT, then of course we respect your support, your contribution for having made, Bored Apes and having made Ape the sort of the strength that it has today. Because we, at the end of the day, we think that, token ecosystems are capitalist sort of societal structures that sort of provide value to those who contribute fairly. But on the other hand, by doing this, we're also saying that most of the value actually goes to people who own the token who can then actually participate in that. And also the majority of all the token supplies ultimately end up going to the community in due course, whether it was the initial airdrop or the staking and other events, right? So I think that was the construction of it. And I'll close with one further thought, which is how you distribute things and how you do sort of, projects like this are very much up for continued experimentation, right? What maybe had been the norm 6 months ago is not the norm today, may not be the norm next month. And this is, on the topic of DAOs, we think, and this is the construction that's so powerful here, is that DAOs will allow us to build novel, new, and inventive sort of consensus mechanisms, essentially allowing us to iterate on democracy and democratic systems, but at the pace of technology. So we can, so what you see today will not be the final form of the ultimate DAO or the ultimate system. We will get there as we have the freedom to experiment with what blockchain enables us to do today.
Thank you for that. I'd just like to go back to a point that you raised there around culture. And over the course of the last couple of days, for those who didn't manage to make it up to Sydney, culture was a topic that I think was introduced and kind of discussed at a far greater level than had been previously. And that's the culture around crypto, that's the culture around Web3, that's the culture around the whole blockchain community. And that's a point that you raised there when you were talking about the influence of culture with these brands. How does Animoca steward culture through its different brands? Like I don't say how seriously do you take it, but what do you put in place to support and protect the culture that's being created through the metaverse, and in turn, support and nurture those who are creating the culture and impacting on that culture? In particular, think about the artists and so forth that are involved in a lot of your different brands. How does that work?
So generally speaking, when we think of NFTs, we also think of them as very much stores of culture, right? And there is this thing, just briefly, around those NFTs that emerged during this time actually are metaverse first brands, whether it's like Sandbox Land or whether it's like Bored Apes, right? These are actually metaverse first brands, and they embody a culture of the moment in time that they represent, right? And they are actually, if you think about Bored Apes or Sandbox, for instance, we think of them as more than just digital assets or digital objects. We think of them as movements, right? The people who own Bored Apes think of themselves as part of something greater than just, I own a Bored Ape and how fancy is that, right? Or the people who own Metaverse Land, like in Sandbox, they think of themselves as having some sort of establishing or supporting something that is greater than just, I own a piece of virtual land. It's something that symbolizes a future that they want to see, that they want to build, that they want to construct, right? And so that's the culture that we think the metaverse represents as a whole, which is, a better future, it's hope, right? And it's actually inclusivity and a more equitable framework. And so in terms of how we think of this, how we try to support that ecosystem is sort of the ethos that we believe in, is how we invest and how we bring. So our white papers and the tokenomics, how much of the tokens, go to us versus how much goes to the community as a whole? Well, you can probably judge just from reading the white paper what kind of culture we're trying to disseminate, what kind of sort of inclusivity we're looking for, right? And you can see this, in terms of the public plans that are out there. So that's one example. The second one is how we invest, right? We want to invest in, founders and sort of companies that have sort of equity and sort of inclusivity as the forefront of their thinking, right? In other words, they're thinking about shared value as opposed to how much value can I take out, right? One of the struggles in, the early days of, where crypto really got a lot of its bad name back in 2017 and early 2018 with all the ICO craze, was that everyone was entering that space in an extractive manner. The investors were also thinking about how much can I invest so I can take out of the system as much as possible, as quickly as possible, which created all the problems, right? And all the framework, all the issues that occurred with. This is changing now with NFTs and with the metaverse, and of course you can't fully control that. So the part that we want to play in is to be thoughtful who we support, who we back, so that they have this mind frame. In terms of the idea space, in terms of the culture, or the kind of art or whatever people do, that we don't want to interfere in, right? That is part of that human ingenuity and diversity of whoever individual or company wants to create. We want to stay away from that ideally, because that is why it's wonderful and beautiful, because they have different ideas about what they want to do. Most importantly is the fact that as long as we share the same values, then I think we have something that we can build together with.
And I think that's probably, I know it's a conversation that we're having here in Australia with some of the large technology companies. It's about that gatekeeper role, and particularly, whatever about wealth, it's the culture that lingers. It's the culture that transgresses through generations. I mean, that's the most important part. And I think it's really significant now when we're in these really early stages of the metaverse that we make sure that we have, as you've said, that open culture, but we have these discussions around the culture that we're bedding in and the role of those gatekeepers. So I suppose it's back to that point that you first made around creating that open metaverse. Animoca are known for, as I said, their large-scale investments. What's your feeling then for the direction for Animoca? Where are you taking it next? What's the next step for you?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure I can say what's next step for us in the sense that we're still super early in the construction of the open metaverse, right? I mean, there's, for us, we think, Web3 and the open metaverse is the natural next evolution of the internet. And if you consider that today there's 4.6 billion people online, of which, there's going to be, billions more eventually online in the course of time, they're not going to be hopefully existing under the Web2 paradigms where they don't own anything. Instead, this internet ownership is going to be across every person. And people who are actually operating in the true open metaverse, like who have MetaMask wallets and who are basically owning their assets and owning NFTs, for instance, that's less than 100 million today. It's still a very small number. So I would say we're hardly done, even though the results appear to be are very strong and the business is growing and everything else in Web3 is growing so fantastic. People would assume that maybe, have we reached a kind of peak? But from our perspective, we're barely even getting off the ground. And so, what we're doing today, acquiring Web2 assets or Web2 game companies and turning them into Web3 is one way in which we want to do this to help grow the space. So you will continue seeing us take that approach as we sort of, try to shepherd companies into Web3. A lot of this is driven by how do we accelerate adoption of Web3? Because one of the bigger risks, as we see it, is that if people don't move into space quickly enough, then inadvertently we will perhaps also create another kind of elite, right? Kind of how the early kinds of technologists who really were able to sort of use code and open source in a way that others couldn't, then you ended up inadvertently creating people who had sort of an advantage over others. And I think there's nothing to say that you shouldn't have a benefit for the hard work you have, but the more people join as quickly as possible, frankly, the more distributed it is. It's like consensus building, right? The more people vote, sort of sooner and quicker, the more equal it will be. So that's kind of how we're thinking about this. And frankly, why we're in such a rush. And it may appear that we're always in a haste, making lots of deals, doing lots of transactions. And that's because, I think, we can't get there fast enough from our perspective.
So is that what keeps you up at night? Is trying to get more people and flattening out the number of people that own or involved or engaged in some way with the metaverse?
Yeah, I mean, and you can see this, for instance, with some projects, for instance, from an Australian-born project, which is Phantom Galaxies, right? They, the way they launched their NFTs was entirely free at a start, where everyone would go in and just claim their first NFT. And those NFTs have traded millions of dollars in value, where people got a way in which they could get included, very much similar to how it happened with Bored Apes in the early days or CryptoPunks in the early days, where it was either free or very, very little cost, but it was a way to include people. And the majority of those users, this was their first NFT experience, right? So that's part of that. What keeps me up at night is the fact that, there's very large centralized organizations who don't want this to happen because they make money from our data. Data is not a property that we should own. Data is property that they should own and they can manipulate because that's how their entire business is constructed. So this is very disruptive and dangerous to them. So they are the ones that we have to worry about from our perspective. They're the ones who don't want this to happen. And so we have to move as quickly as possible. And the way we think of it, this is as more and more people are in the open metaverse, like a sort of global trade framework, if you will, and it becomes larger and larger. It becomes impossible for those closed ecosystems to survive because they become islands by themselves, and it forces them open. But if most of us decide to, just exist in a closed metaverse or in a closed ecosystem entirely, then actually we live by their rules, and it will be hard to break out because they end up sort of manipulating and controlling that network effect, as we have seen today with some of the large tech companies.
I've just got a red flashing light in front of me, which tells me that our time here is drawing to a close. But yeah, thank you so very, very much for your time and for sharing your views on some of those kind of really topical but important issues. And I think fundamentally, I think for all of us that are watching and listening, it's about that message around the need for an open metaverse. It's about that need to positively influence culture, because this is something that we're laying down a bedrock for future generations. Would you say that was a fair assessment?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you again for having me.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Yat Siu.